What is this? Am I gonna learn something? I don't know if I want to learn today.
Welcome to a behind-the-scenes VIP visit to the world's most famous zoo, the San Diego Zoo.
San Diego Zoo?
The San Diego Zoo, the world-famous wildlife
Ooh,
haven bursting with vibrant life. Nestled in the Balboa Park, this sprawling 100-acre zoo is home to thousands of rare and endangered creatures from across the globe. Pulling in millions of visitors every year, each exhibit offers an up-close glimpse into the wonders of the animal kingdom. With its lush tropical landscapes and immersive habitats, the San Diego Zoo really is a full-on adventure. Well, on the 13th of February, 1971, San Diego Zoo welcomed a new addition. An orangutan was born. The son of the zoo's Maggie and Bob, it was decided he would be named Ken Allen, after the two zookeepers that would go on to care for him in his early years, Ken Willingham and Ben Allen. And this ape's time at San Diego Zoo would go on to be nothing shy of remarkable. So, after his birth, young Ken Allen didn't have the greatest start in life. It appeared that his mother was sadly failing to properly care for him, nearly accidentally smothering him. So, the team at San Diego Zoo felt it was best for Ken's safety to separate him from his mother and place him in his own cage. As a young adolescent, Ken seemed to quickly acclimatise to his enclosure and loved the company of his zookeepers and other humans alike. A very sociable, intelligent young ape. And like all young playful apes, Ken was quite the troublemaker. But it was at nightfall when Ken would really shoot into action. One night, as the San Diego Zoo closed its doors and Ken's keepers were heading home after a long day's work, it seemed that Ken didn't particularly like the idea of being left confined to his small metal prison. Well, Ken had learned to unscrew the bolts of his cage to free himself, and once out, he'd just roam around his nursery. So the next morning, as staff arrived, there they found Ken playing with his toys as his cage sat dismantled behind him. Assuming there'd just been some sort of structural error with the cage framework, the zookeeper simply put it back together again, and as night drew in, they led Ken back into the newly assembled cage. Well, Ken had made a note of this. So that night, as their shifts ended,
he will remember that!
Left, once again, Ken started to unscrew the bolts of his cage and simply messed about. He loved the freedom, but this time was different. Ken had learned that the morning was when the zookeepers would start their shifts and return, and he wasn't going to be caught out again. So after yet another night of freedom, as the sunlight slowly crept in through the window of his nursery, this time around, Ken climbed back into his cage and started re-securing the bolts as if nothing had happened. This way, when the keepers entered the nursery that morning, there they saw Ken sat well-behaved in his cage as if he'd been there the entire night. Well, Ken's master plan would go on for a few nights. He would unscrew the cage, play in the nursery, return to the cage, and then reassemble it. Everything was going swimmingly. But there was one small thing that Ken didn't account for. Eventually, the zookeeper started to notice that when they'd return in the morning, whilst Ken was sat content in his cage, his toys weren't in the places that the staff had left them the night before. So, with a hunch, that night, the keepers said their goodbyes to Ken and they pretended to leave. But rather than heading home, they sat quietly outside of Ken's nursery and waited. And after a while, as they expected, they started to hear noises. So they abruptly burst through the door, and there they saw Ken, cage dismantled, playing with his toys. So the jig was up. Ken was placed into a new, much sturdier cage, and that put a stop to his late night antics once and for all. But trust me when I say, this was merely the beginning when it came to Ken Allen. Things for San Diego Zoo would get far, far worse. It's military and epic, but one giant leap for the fact that you could play War Thunder for it. To be I'm off to have a free pint, so back to the video. So skip forward a few years, and the zookeepers felt it was finally time for Ken to be shown off to the public. And he was placed into the Heart of the Zoo exhibit that had opened just 3 years prior. But when Ken first moved in, he wasted no time in turning his hand to mischief. When a film crew turned up to document the gorilla enclosure next door, Ken decided it'd be a good idea to hurl rocks at them. And then when he ran out of rocks, he used his own shit. And keepers would also report seeing Ken fashioning branches into DIY ladders that he would then thump into the ground with his own fist, climb up to the top, and then climb all the way back down. Now it's important to note that Ken wasn't alone in this enclosure. Keepers decided that maybe it was best that he had some company this time around, so they placed him in an enclosure with a bunch of other orangutans. So there was a number of female orangutans, Ken, and one other male named Otis. Now, if you know the first thing about the animal kingdom, 2 males and a bunch of females doesn't usually end too well. To put it bluntly, Ken grew to despise Otis. I'm talking cold-blooded hatred, resulting in numerous feuds. So the zookeeper's idea of giving Ken some company had seemingly backfired. So they cut their losses and moved Ken into his own enclosure. So there he was, alone once again. Now let's have a think, shall we? Last time Ken was alone, what did he do? That's right, baby. He started planning his next escape. So on the 13th of June 1985, a 14-year-old Ken Allen managed to climb up the wall of his enclosure and
oh my god, he was only 14.
Now, what exactly did Ken do after his valiant escape? Well, he very confidently just strolled around the zoo amongst visitors, minding his own business, observing the other animals. Oh, look at the elephants. Wow, look at that giraffe. He wasn't aggressive or agitated. In fact, Ken loved the attention. Well, this escapade went on until the zookeepers were made aware of Ken's escape. Now, they knew that if Ken was to attack anybody, they would be forced to put him down.
Because of his strength, because he is a wild animal, the potential is there to do harm, to hurt somebody badly.
So slightly panicked, they hesitantly approached Ken, but he caused no trouble at all. And then they quickly
just wanted to walk around and have a good time.
He complied with. Now, whilst Ken Allen was chilled, enjoying his day spent roaming the zoo, the same couldn't be said for the zoo's staff. They were having a meltdown. They knew if news of Ken Allen's escape went public, they would have a PR disaster on their hands. But of course, they had no control over the news leaking.
He's
I mean, there
just a
was an
little
orangutan
guy.
walking amongst members of the public. That does turn heads. So as the news broke, the staff at the San Diego Zoo prepared for the worst. But rather than the expected PR disaster, Ken Allen became somewhat of a local hero, and it actually worked in the zoo's favour. With everyone reading the news about Ken, people just had to see for themselves.
They want to
the
see the smart monkeys.
Skyrocketed. Well, despite the media buzz, behind the scenes, San Diego Zoo were doing all they could to prevent another escape. Sure, the attention was great, but one instance of an escaped ape was enough for them. Zoo officials decided they needed to step up security of Ken's pen, so they installed a moat around the perimeter of his enclosure and installed a 250-foot wall. This was bound to stop Ken in his tracks, and thankfully, it worked. Crisis averted. The security measures successfully contained Ken Allen. For all of a few weeks, that is. Because on the 29th of July, 1985, Ken managed to escape again. He somehow made his way over the moat, and just like his last escape, the 250-pound orangutan effortlessly scaled his enclosure wall. And yet again, he did the same, just casually strolling around the zoo amongst visitors.
Oh my god, this monkey don't give a fuck.
But this time, there was one more thing Ken wanted to do on his day trip.
What?
So as the zookeepers were once again made aware of Ken's escape, they frantically ran out to the zoo for a second time to capture Ken. And there they found him, stood over an enclosure. But this time, he wasn't looking at the pretty elephants. There Ken was, picking up rocks and pelting them at none other than Otis, Ken's ex-roommate and sworn enemy. But this second escape had only escalated the media hype around Ken. The already packed San Diego Zoo had more and more visitors each day. All
Fuck
eager
you,
to see
Otis!
Ken Allen, the ape that could not be contained. But yet again, as for the staff at San Diego Zoo, whilst thankful for the increase in ticket sales, they simply could not let this happen again. 2 escapes was already far too many. Things were really getting silly now. Every effort the zookeepers had applied to try and halt Ken's escapes was failing. They needed to really step things up this time around. So for the time being, they moved Ken into an indoor pen that reportedly had a black and white television that featured just one channel. So as Ken sat and watched TV, the staff started to draft a plan to further beef up Ken's main enclosure and increase security, fortify the place properly. So as the staff gathered around and started pitching ideas, meanwhile, outside of zoo grounds, after the media had caught wind of the second escape, things had gotten bonkers. Ken Allen had become somewhat of an icon. Free Ken Allen t-shirts started popping up all over the place.
Where's my free Ken Allen t-shirt?
Bumper stickers appearing on cars all over San Diego. A group of pensioners formed a Ken Allen fan club aptly named the Orang Gang, complete with a monthly newsletter. And maybe the strangest outcome of Ken's fame, a San Diego-based psychiatrist named Dennis Gersten released a single, The Ballad of Ken Allen.
What?
Yeah, shit was getting weird. Headlines started referring to Ken Allen as Hairy Houdini, a name that fit him perfectly. So back at the zoo, with all eyes on them, the staff started their efforts to beef up Ken's main enclosure once and for all. So with the master plan finished, they started by surrounding the wall with a powerful electric fence. Then they hired a pair of professional rock climbers to try and scale the enclosure wall so staff could seek out the foot and handholds and patch over them, making a chance of a route to the top virtually impossible.
Making the walls smoother, straight up and down, taking all the little bumps and ridges out of the wall that he could possibly get a handhold on.
Also, the keepers had noted that Ken would only really ever attempt to escape when he was in an enclosure alone. And of course, when they attempted to put him in an enclosure with other orangutans, the only real issue was the fact that there was another male, Otis. So, zookeepers decided that the best course of action would be to introduce some female orangutans into the upgraded enclosure and no other males, in the hopes that the company might calm him down. So with the big security renovations finally complete, they decided it was time to free Ken from his indoor prison. He'd watched enough black and white TV and
Too
they
much
released him
television,
into
not
the
for
newly
you.
upgraded enclosure. But that wasn't all the staff had up their
Ken.
sleeve. This time, they decided
Otis
it was best
is the name
that
of
they
his
monitored
enemy.
Ken. See what he got up to, learn his habits, see
Yeah,
if he was
fuck you,
acting
Otis.
fishy. But this is Ken Allen we're talking about. This is one smart orangutan.
He's
knew
pretty
that when he
smart.
saw humans dressed in zoo uniform, he couldn't act out or pull any wise moves, as he knew they were watching. But this time, the staff were one step ahead of Ken. So to get round this, they would disguise themselves in normal, casual clothing, blue jeans, white shirts, sunglasses, as if they were just regular old bystanders visiting the zoo. That way, they could watch Ken and he'd have no idea they were members of staff. A tactic that the zoo coined guerrilla tactics. Okay, 1 gold star for that one, San Diego Zoo. I'll give it to you. So how did it all go? Well, their plan worked. Ken didn't try to escape. So there Ken was, busy not escaping.
Now he's having a
relaxing,
great time
sitting around.
relaxing.
Oh, he has a crowbar. It seemed that Ken had discovered the tool when it had been seemingly left behind by a construction worker.
What?
Not particularly wanting to approach a crowbar-wielding orangutan, the zookeepers watched over helplessly. But to their relief, Ken threw it aside, landing at the feet of fellow orangutan, Vicky. Now, knowing she was far calmer than Ken, the keepers weren't too worried about her. Until that is, they heard a large crunch and Vicky had used the crowbar to try and pry open the glass of the enclosure window in an attempt to free herself and Ken. That's right, Ken had
wanted to run away together
and was training other orangutans to aid him in his escapes.
Pretty clever, as if they learned from the master himself.
There must be some kind of orangutan communication going on here.
Thankfully,
Oh
the zoo
my
staff, this time
God.
around, they caught Ken and Vicky almost instantly before they made it out to the public and then re-secured the window. So after making sure all the loose tools were secure and feeding the construction worker to the alligators, it seemed that Ken, for the most part, was behaving himself. They did catch him one time, managing to scale the wall, despite the rock climber's best efforts, but when he eventually reached the electric fence, he lightly brushed it, got quite the zap, and quickly made his way back down. The San Diego Zoo had outdone themselves. Finally, all the work the staff had put in had seemingly worked to keep Ken Allen at bay. Ken started to settle down, and the media started to report that he'd become somewhat of a family man, and it looked as if his escapes had finally been put to rest. But it seemed that
There's
Ken
always a but.
was simply buying his time. Because 2 years later, the pump that fueled the moat around Ken's enclosure had conveniently clogged, drying up the moat completely.
no.
And this allowed for a clear and easy path to the wall. Ken then sat patiently and waited for the moment that the power to the electric fence was shut off for maintenance. How he knew this is still a mystery. But with
What?
the
How the
timing
fuck did he
perfect,
know that?
He capitalized, making a bolt for it. And once again, after his 2-year hiatus, he'd come out of retirement, and it was like he'd never stopped. Back to his old ways, he strolled around the zoo, taking photo after photo, everybody raving that they had seen Ken Allen, Hairy Houdini, the ape that could not be contained. But this time around, When he saw the guards approaching in the distance, Ken wasn't as calm as he was during his other escapes. He made a bolt for the lion enclosure, dodging and weaving, making the most of his freedom, crowds cheering as he sprinted. He was really pushing the boat out this time. This was the furthest away Ken had ever been from his enclosure.
Oh my god, he traveled pretty far.
Into the lion enclosure and be their next meal. Staff were hot on his heels, and after 3 long hours, he was eventually cornered by gun-wielding zookeepers and led back to his enclosure. Luckily, the zookeepers knew that the only reason the escape was possible was due to the moat drying up and the power shutting off, and once repaired, the fortifications that had worked for 2 years would still be up to scratch. But while secure, what the keepers had underestimated once more was the fact that Ken had roommates. Things have been going great, but we all know how things go when you surround Ken with female orangutans. Ken isn't exactly the best influence on the ladies. But it wasn't Ken this time. One day before the zoo opening time, Jane and Kumang had found a 5-foot long handled squeegee that a cleaner had accidentally left in the enclosure. And inspired by Ken, the two somehow used it to climb up the wall and hop out. Jane apparently wandered into an employee-only lounge area, finished off some of their sodas, and was found roaming around near the flamingos, where she had to be tranquilized and returned to her enclosure. And thankfully, Kumang willingly returned. But while she was the tamer ape this time around, it seems that Kumang wanted her own chapter in the adventure book. She managed to escape 2 additional times by shortening the electric fence wires with a twig. The first time, she was found sat playing in a garden bed where she was tranquilized. Then the second time, she was sat outside the monkey enclosure, and when approached by staff, she climbed on top of the bird sanctuary where she was tranquilized again. In fact, Kumang's mischief actually got the group put in solitary confinement once more, whilst the keepers made the wiring system more complex, upgraded the doors, and went around with an electromagnet.
Why don't they just let them out from time to time just to walk around when there's no guests in the park? Just like to hang out, you know? It'll get it out of their system.
Through his students. At this point, the zoo had reportedly spent a whopping $45,000 on security over the course of the escapes. As for Ken himself, as years passed, it seems that the escapes at San Diego Zoo really had finally come to an end this time. Ken was living a simpler life in his enclosure, sat relaxing, eating, and flipping off children that walked by. Ken settled down for years to come. He had finally decided to behave himself and stayed put in his enclosure. He had truly given up on his old ways. Well, in the winter of 2000, the zookeepers noticed that Ken was acting out of the ordinary. He was moving erratically and seemed uncomfortable, so the staff sent him in for a visit with the zoo doctor. Ken was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, a form of blood cancer. Now, at first, doctors weren't too worried, as Ken was still young and fit and would most likely be able to fight off the disease. But sadly, as time went on, Ken's condition deteriorated and the cancer had become more aggressive. The cancer that was now terminal. So the zookeepers decided that rather than letting Ken suffer at the age of 29, on December 1st, 2000, Ken Allen was euthanized.
Options for chemotherapy were explored, but at this time, the therapy was mainly geared towards making Kenny as comfortable as possible.
His condition had worsened over the last several days.
I'm gonna cry.
Brought great joy to the San Diego Zoo for over 29 years. The loss of this type of animal is a great loss to our organization. This is a sad day at the San Diego Zoo. At 11:05 today, Ken Allen was put down.
The Orangang published a 2-page spread as a tribute to Ken and hosted a candlelit vigil for him, stating he would have done the same for us. To this day, a plaque sits in San Diego Zoo in Ken Allen's honor. So there you go.
Did he even let him go outside by himself before he died?
$45,000, t-shirts, bumper stickers, a fan club, a single, and a hell of a tale.
Oh man, I'm all
I've made sure to link to the main
over a
sources
monkey.
that helped to tell this story below, if you want to read into it some more. And shout out to Count Dankula, who covered this story a while back with a hilarious retelling in his Absolute Mad Lad series, which actually led me to make this video.
Man, I'm all teary-eyed over a monkey. That was so sad. What the fuck?